There is something profoundly unsettling about the decision to bring JonBenet's body upstairs. At face value, it appears to be an emotional act, a father retrieving his child, but when examined through a forensic and psychological lens, the motivations become murkier. This was not simply about discovering a body. It was about presentation, timing, and control. John's behavior suggests someone who wasn't just reacting, but staging, not necessarily in the theatrical sense of planting evidence, but in the subtle performance of intent, guilt, or even helplessness, a performance that plays out most clearly when time is running out and eyes are starting to turn inward. Philosophically, we must ask, what does it mean to present a dead body to authority? Is it a plea for help, a gesture of closure, or a bid for control over the narrative? John brings JonBenet upstairs not just because he found her, but because he knew others would soon descend. That gesture, moving the body rather than alerting the police at the scene, is telling. It reframes the act from one of discovery to one of delivery. Like a student turning in a half finished project while asking for leniency, it bears the marks of someone trying to escape accusation by appearing cooperative just in time. The speed with which this occurs, 5 minutes from basement to top of the stairs, further reinforces the idea that John was working against a clock, not just grief. At the heart of this lies a psychological dissonance. When people are rushed and under scrutiny, they default to preserving their own sense of narrative. John's actions mirror the tension between wanting to be seen as a hero and fearing what might be discovered. If he had continued working on the body downstairs and called for help immediately, it might have appeared genuine. But instead, he chose to carry her upstairs and interfere with evidence under the eyes of law enforcement. That tension, the need to look like a father and the urge to stay in control, is precisely where suspicion grows. Let's dive right in. In a 1997 interview with BPD, John Ramsey detailed his frantic attempts to untie the ligatures binding his daughter, JonBenet, after he discovered her body in the basement. Upon finding JonBenet, who was lying on a blanket with her arms tied behind her head and black tape over her mouth, John's immediate hope was that she was okay. He recounted his actions, stating in the 1997 interview that he first removed the tape from her lips. Noting that her lips were blue, immediately after removing the tape, he tried to untie her hands and arms. In a June 1998 interview with Smith and Kane, John Ramsey further elaborated on the ligatures, explaining that JonBenet's arms were tied up behind her head. When asked if they were tied tightly, he responded, "Yeah, very tight." He observed that her skin was swollen around the bindings, indicating how taut they were, and he found them not easy to get off. Despite the difficulty, he attempted to untie them quickly before picking her up. He stated that when he carried her upstairs, the ligature was still partially around her wrist, indicating he hadn't fully removed it in the basement. After bringing her into the living room upstairs, he recounted that he later tried to untie the knot further on her arms, but was stopped by Linda Arndt, a detective present at the scene. Adding to the official record, the Boulder District Attorney's Office investigative memo clarified that John Ramsey specifically removed the wrist ligature from JonBenet's left hand soon after discovering her body. This memo, drawing from Nagel's recollection, also noted that John Ramsey removed the duct tape from her mouth. The JonBenet forensic files further describes the wrist ligatures, stating they were composed of white, braided olefin cord, similar in size and construction to the cord used for the garrote found around her neck. It specifies that a ligature was attached to each of her wrists, and both ends were frayed. John Ramsey removed the one from her left wrist. The ligature on her right wrist was loosely tied over her long-sleeve white pajamas, and both knots remained intact. The knot on the right wrist was identified as a lark's head knot, while the one John Ramsey removed from the left wrist was a Z noose, designed to pull the wrist together. Significantly, no DNA was developed from this item. The illogical focus on the wrist ligature instead of the head or breathing, the choice to focus on untying the wrist ligature rather than immediately addressing the area around the neck or head contradicts the basic physiological signals of emergency response. Cyanosis, indicated by JonBenet's blue lips, is a visual flag for asphyxiation. This should instinctively draw attention to the airway, brain oxygenation, and cranial circulation. Any average adult, much less a father with a high level of education and military background, would reasonably interpret blue lips as a sign that something around the mouth, throat, or head is cutting off air. Instead, John's reaction bypassed this entire region and focused on the wrist, where there were no immediate indicators of life-threatening distress. From a deductive standpoint, this behavior lacks coherence. If we apply logical triage reasoning, prioritizing interventions based on immediate threat to life, the wrist does not rank above the airway. Any responder with even a layman's understanding of emergency care would treat oxygen loss before restraint. Even if the wrist ligature had been tight, It posed no direct threat to JonBenet's vital functions. The neck and cranial ligature, on the other hand, directly threatened her capacity to breathe, regulate brain activity, and maintain consciousness. Deductive logic therefore positions the head region as the obvious first point of attention. Philosophically, this decision undermines what criminologists call the rational actor model. This model assumes that individuals respond to crises in a way that seeks to preserve life or prevent harm based on rational appraisal of stimuli. If John Ramsey acted irrationally, then the burden shifts to explain why. Was he overwhelmed, distracted, acting out of guilt? Or was he avoiding the area of the body where evidence was most damning? Philosophically, when behavior appears inconsistent with instinctual or rational responses, it invites suspicion, not necessarily of intent, but of alignment with truth. In forensic terms, this redirection to the wrist creates interpretive noise around the scene. It diverts the visual and procedural focus away from the cord around the neck, the knot's construction, and possible fiber or DNA evidence that would be collected from an undisturbed ligature. It is not just illogical, it's disruptive to the forensic record. Investigators rely heavily on untouched or unmanipulated evidence to form timelines and reconstruct sequences. By acting on the wrist instead of the head, John may have unintentionally or intentionally interfered with that clarity. Another layer of complexity arises when we consider how John described this act later. His emphasis on struggling with the right wrist knot rather than attempting to assess JonBenet's breathing, pulse, or responsiveness is telling. Most parents, even in panic, attempt some form of resuscitation, such as CPR or at least checking for vital signs. Instead, John places narrative weight on the difficulty of the knot, as if the knot's resistance justifies abandoning it and scooping her up. This linguistic framing aligns with someone trying to justify a misprioritized action after the fact, rather than an act driven by reflexive concern for life. The physical position of the body also raises questions. If JonBenet were lying on her back or side, the visibility of facial cyanosis would be immediate. Any tension in the ligature around the neck would be noticeable. Choosing to go for the wrist first suggests a decision not driven by a desperate need to save her, but perhaps by a desire to stage or distract. It is not impossible, but it strains the plausibility of a father reacting spontaneously and sincerely to a deadly scene involving his child. Furthermore, we must consider the symbolic framing of untying the wrist. If the wrist restraint was part of the overall crime scene tableau, removing it alters the visual grammar of the event. In criminology, this is known as scene manipulation, where perpetrators or those connected to the victim alter elements not to conceal the crime entirely, but to shift its perceived nature. Freeing a wrist may visually suggest freedom or partial escape, changing the narrative from full restraint to partial release. Even unconsciously, this action reshapes the interpretive lens for investigators. Ultimately, this behavior introduces a critical dissonance. The scene presents signs of a fatal struggle focused around the head and neck, while the father directs attention to a non-lethal wrist restraint. From both a physiological and deductive standpoint, this is a mismatch. In criminology, mismatches like this are often where the truth begins to crack. It is not about proving guilt. It is about identifying where logic fails to hold up under pressure, and where logic fails, intention or concealment often begins. Second, the lack of logical use of tools and help despite clear options. One of the most striking details about the basement scene is the availability of tools that were not used in the moment. Patsy Ramsey had been wrapping gifts earlier that day, an activity that nearly always involved scissors. Standard wrapping paper was present, not gift bags, indicating that cutting was required, meaning scissors were likely nearby. Yet when John Ramsey discovered JonBenet and encountered difficulty untying the right wrist ligature, he never called out to Fleet White or anyone else to retrieve scissors. This lack of urgency to obtain an obvious solution undermines the narrative of panic and desperation and instead suggests a kind of selective thinking or controlled behavior. From a logical and deductive standpoint, failing to reach for scissors, when time was allegedly of the essence, represents a deviation from rational decision making. If a person is encountering resistance with a cord and tools are known to be close by, the most direct path is to cut the material. That would have allowed for faster intervention, whether to check vitals or simply free the body. The absence of this step implies either a lapse in awareness inconsistent with his otherwise coordinated decisions, or a choice to delay, possibly to maintain control over the optics of the scene, or to manipulate what evidence would or would not be disturbed. Physiologically, the body's emergency response system releases a surge of adrenaline in high stress moments. This fight or flight system is supposed to sharpen focus and increase responsiveness to immediate threats. For John, this means that if he truly believed JonBenet was in danger or in need of resuscitation, the nervous system should have supported rapid decision making, especially involving basic problem solving like getting scissors. The lack of such responsiveness suggests that either His brain was not interpreting the scene as an emergency or that he was operating under a different set of priorities. In terms of philosophical criminology, the concept of intentional omission becomes relevant. This refers to the conscious or subconscious decision not to take a logical action in a moment where the stakes are high. Failing to seek out scissors when struggling with a ligature is not just oversight. It may be omission with purpose. Whether that purpose was to avoid altering the ligature more than necessary or to avoid disrupting certain visual evidence becomes part of the interpretive frame. The tools were present, but they were ignored, raising the question, why? Additionally, John's actions do not align with the behavior of someone overcome by panic or helplessness. He assessed the tightness of the knot, made an internal decision that it was too difficult, and opted to abandon the task and carry the body upstairs. That decision demonstrates measured thought, even if it was misguided. So, why would a man capable of that level of rational processing fail to consider the most effective way to remove the cord, especially when that method was practically within arm's reach? The answer likely lies not in chaos, but in control. Control becomes the core philosophical thread. In forensic psychology, controlling the scene is often the behavior of someone who is invested in how the scene will later be perceived. The choice to untie instead of cut, to handle instead of call for law enforcement, and to move instead of preserve reflects an internal logic that prioritizes image or narrative over clarity. The scene becomes less about rescue and more about direction, directing what details investigators will see and how they will see them. Another aspect to consider is collaborative response. Fleet White was present, standing right there, and yet no coordinated response took place. John didn't say, get scissors or call for help. He acted unilaterally, without delegating or orchestrating a cooperative effort. In moments of trauma, shared problem solving is common, even instinctual. The absence of that shared urgency signals that either the stakes weren't perceived as real or that the goal wasn't resuscitation but management of the situation. This speaks volumes about the psychological state John may have been in during that discovery. In summary, the tools were there, help was present, and yet the actions taken reflect neither desperation nor reflexive love. They reflect deliberation. The deliberate avoidance of the most efficient solution to a visible problem stands out not as a panic response, but as something more measured and potentially more manipulative. In forensic terms, it isn't just what was done that matters, it's what wasn't done. The scissors tell us more in their silence than the knots do in their resistance. Third, the decision to act alone instead of calling authorities, a pattern of interference. When John Ramsey discovered the broken window in the basement, rather than immediately preserving the scene or calling law enforcement to examine it as a potential point of entry or exit, he chose to investigate it himself. This choice, though seemingly minor, speaks volumes when analyzed through the lens of deductive reasoning and criminological behavior. In any potential crime scene, especially involving a child in a wealthy household, securing points of ingress and egress is critical to preserve trace evidence. Tampering with that area risks destroying fingerprints, shoe prints, or hair fibers. It also indicates a behavioral pattern of wanting to solve the scene himself instead of trusting professionals to assess it impartially. This same pattern appears when John finds JonBenet's body. Rather than immediately shouting for police officers or trained emergency responders to come to the basement, he chooses to untie a wrist, carry the body upstairs, and place her on the floor in a heavily trafficked area. This sequence contradicts best practices for preserving evidence. It also introduces questions about motive. If his goal was to protect the scene and get justice for his daughter, his actions undermine both. The only logical explanation, given the high stakes, would be a desire to shape what others would see and possibly to overwrite how the story would be told through the lens of physical evidence. The psychological underpinning of this behavior leans toward control under crisis. Many people panic and freeze, others call for help. But John takes decisive action, always alone, always silent. He doesn't delegate. He doesn't involve others. This is key. Psychologists recognize this as a behavior pattern consistent with individuals who either distrust institutional authority or are deeply invested in controlling perception. The choice not to call down police when JonBenet is found may also suggest a compartmentalized cognition, an awareness that calling them down at that moment would hand over the most revealing portion of the crime scene untouched. From a philosophical criminology standpoint, we must reflect on the ethics of interference. Even if one believes they are acting out of love or desperation, interference in a crime scene moves the needle from bystander to participant. Philosophers of law and justice argue that when a person alters the state of a body, the surrounding evidence, or the physical layout of a scene, they interrupt the objective record of what occurred. In this case, John's actions delayed the official recording of her body's placement. The knot structure, potential fibers on the blanket or floor, and even bodily reactions such as rigor or lividity patterns. These details are not small, they are the spine of any criminal investigation. The repeated theme of self directed action also paints a character sketch. John Ramsey operates as the lone resolver in moments when deference to authority is most needed. When he moved the body, when he touched the wrist ligature, and when he investigated the window, all these moments reveal an internal compass that points away from transparency. And this cannot be attributed to panic alone, because these actions were coordinated, purposeful, and often verbally justified after the fact. This suggests post hoc rationalization, a hallmark of stage behavior rather than spontaneous grief. Physiologically, we would expect a parent in genuine panic to scream, hyperventilate, or collapse, overwhelmed by emotional trauma. But John's calm processing, selective engagement, and orderly decision making reveal a lack of involuntary crisis response. His body does not behave like it's in shock. There's no disassociation, no trembling, no loss of motor coordination. Instead, he behaves like someone solving a problem. This, when taken together with his silence and refusal to involve others, leans forensic suspicion toward concealment rather than chaos. In logical terms, the question becomes what is gained and what is lost by acting alone? John lost the opportunity for law enforcement to see the body in situ. He lost potential DNA or touch evidence from areas around the head. He introduced his own fibers, skin cells, and emotional reactions onto the blanket and floor where the body was moved. The only thing gained was the ability to reframe the scene and emotionally dominate the moment, perhaps even to collapse public scrutiny into sympathy. From a logical and forensic point of view, that gain cannot be ignored. Ultimately, we see a man who consistently opts to act alone in moments where collaboration, transparency, or deference would be more appropriate. This is not a question of guilt, but of pattern. That pattern undermines the credibility of later recollections. It undermines the chain of custody. And most of all, it undermines the very clarity that JonBenét's case has long lacked. In crime scene investigation, the truth often lies not in what is found, but in what is moved. John Ramsey moved everything, and that motion echoes louder than silence. In The Other Side of Suffering, John Ramsey's memoir, he described the immediate moment of discovery, noting that her hands were bound together by a cord and there was black duct tape across her mouth. He detailed pulling the tape off her mouth, focusing on communicating with her, and feeling a mixture of relief and terror. While this account focuses on the tape, it sets the scene for his subsequent actions regarding the bindings. He also later reflected on the neck garrote, noting in his book that the knots were complex and reflected the sophistication of someone who knew how to use such a garrote. This reflects his general impression of the binding techniques used. Disjointed response and disrupted logical sequence. When evaluating the behavior of someone who discovers a loved one in distress, especially a parent discovering a child, there is a generally predictable pattern rooted in instinct and logic. Begin by checking the most vital areas. Typically, a person would focus first on the head and neck, regions most vulnerable to fatal harm. In John Ramsey's case, the decision to remove the tape from JonBenét's mouth does appear appropriate at first glance. However, what follows does not support a coherent logical progression. Rather than assessing the full head and neck area after removing the tape, John diverts his attention to her arms and wrists, skipping over the ligature deeply embedded in the upper body. This deviation from a sequential, rational bodily scan raises questions about cognitive dissonance and intentional distraction. Deductive reasoning, especially in crisis, tends to follow urgency cues. A person in shock may act out of order, but John's behavior is inconsistent not just with panic, but with any clear prioritization of damage control. Once the tape was removed and no gag or obstruction was found, a logical next step would have been to inspect the airway, particularly the ligature around her neck. The fact that this did not occur strongly implies either willful avoidance or an internalized hierarchy of actions, one that does not match a rescue-minded parent, but rather someone managing a scene. The psychological underpinnings of trauma response include both hyperfocus and dissociation. It is possible, theoretically, that John was fixating on manageable parts of the body, like the wrists, because they were less gruesome or more emotionally distant. But this explanation falters when we recall that he had the presence of mind to remove the tape without hesitation. If he were frozen by fear or emotional overload, one would expect more hesitation, more collapse into irrational behavior. Instead, we see oddly selective decisiveness. This type of targeted control undercuts any argument that John was simply overwhelmed or emotionally impaired. In forensic criminology, there is the concept of behavioral staging, when a person alters a scene either to mislead investigators or to reconcile what they've seen with what they want others to believe. A disjointed sequence of body inspection could be a subconscious form of staging, wherein certain steps are performed to appear helpful or shocked, while others are avoided because they might disrupt planted evidence or because the person knows what lies ahead. Avoiding the ligature around the neck arguably the most important sight, might be an indication that John already understood the implications of its presence. Further analysis reveals a deeper philosophical problem, the issue of moral priority. If one truly believes their child may be dead or dying, there should be an urgency to uncover the truth. Ligature around JonBenét's neck was not hidden. It was visibly wound and tight, suggesting it might be the source of her fatal injury. Philosophically, one must ask, why wouldn't a father go directly to the area that could potentially explain her condition? This absence of logical prioritization suggests that the act of discovery may not have been about learning new information, but about executing a plan. In matters of intention versus action, philosophers and psychologists alike note that incongruent sequences often betray concealed motives. A person whose stated intention is to help, but whose actions follow an illogical or avoidant sequence, may be internally conflicted or externally manipulating. John's movement from tape to wrist, skipping over the neck, does not align with the urgency of life-saving intention. Instead, it mirrors a kind of checklist performance: remove the obvious, touch the safe, avoid the damning. The movement pattern itself betrays either foreknowledge or denial. In either case, it strays from natural human behavior. A father discovering his daughter would either break down, rush to help her airway, or shout for assistance. What we see here is a quiet, methodical operation with selective engagement. This isn't indicative of panic, it's indicative of control, with deliberate engagement in some areas and complete omission in others. That kind of compartmentalized attention isn't typical of someone confronting tragedy for the first time. It's more typical of someone compartmentalizing guilt or fear. Taken together, the disjointed response, the unusual sequence of focus, and the missing urgency in the most critical area suggests not just a lapse in logic, but a reframing of intent. When people act against logic, forensic analysts must ask whether it's due to panic, ignorance, or premeditated redirection. In this case, the omission of the neck area, when tape and wrists were immediately handled, strongly hints at an inner logic foreign to emergency behavior. Instead of rescue, we appear to witness stage management. Second, the speed slowness paradox, psychological timing, and the weight of surveillance. John Ramsey's movements between 1 and 1:05 a.m. present a curious interplay of urgency and deliberation that calls into question the organic nature of his actions. From a logical standpoint, 5 minutes is a very narrow window to descend into the basement, discover the body of your child, remove multiple forms of restraint, abandon the effort partway through, and return upstairs with her in your arms. The swiftness suggests prior knowledge of where she was and what condition she was in. It also implies that no real investigation or evaluation took place. John didn't spend any time analyzing the window, assessing signs of entry, or even calling out for help upon discovery. This creates a tension between the expectation of frantic parental behavior and what actually appears, a mechanical performance. Psychologically, such patterned urgency often reflects a rehearsed or pressured state. Human behavior under stress tends to fragment into either freezing, fleeing, or focused action. But here we see an unusual fourth type, what might be called surveillance-induced haste. There is a rhythm to his behavior that mirrors how people act when they feel watched. This is the same dynamic seen when drivers suddenly speed up under the gaze of a tailgater, or when a customer hastily makes a decision at a counter because the line behind them is growing. It is not the urgency of instinct, it is the haste of self-consciousness. In criminology, this type of situational haste is often a clue to motive. When someone is rushing not because of danger, but because of the perceived scrutiny of others, it is often because they are trying to execute a task before they are interrupted or questioned. John's choice to spend zero time calling the police, shouting for help, or explaining what he found strongly suggests he wasn't processing the scene as someone surprised or devastated. Rather, it suggests he was working through a pre-selected list of actions. Get her, remove what you can, bring her up. The key is not just what he did, but how unnaturally quickly he did it. From a physiological standpoint, stress and panic can compress time perception. But in this case, the clock tells us plainly 5 minutes elapsed. That means every choice was deliberate. And if he truly attempted to untie a difficult knot, then abandoned it, that moment alone would consume a large portion of those 5 minutes. What this tells us is that decisions were made rapidly, too rapidly for someone discovering their child's body for the first time. This again leans away from trauma response and towards scene manipulation. The philosophical dimension of criminology speaks here to moral staging, the idea that people attempt to look like they are doing the right thing rather than actually doing the right thing. If John had truly been overwhelmed by grief or panic, he would have been frozen, called for help, or even collapsed. But his behavior reflects a mixture of control and omission. He did enough to appear active, but not enough to invite scrutiny. The rapidity with which he moved from tape to wrist to giving up on the tight knot almost mirrors someone checking boxes under time constraints, not someone caught in raw parental terror. The window into the psyche comes especially from the unfinished task. If John had been guided by pure instinct, he would have followed through fully with the right wrist or pivoted to the neck. But the fact that he abandoned the task suggests that the pressure to appear proactive clashed with the internal realization that continuing the action might create further complications, either forensically or emotionally. In short, he hit the ceiling of what he was willing to do, not what he was able to do. Moreover, there is an unmistakable symbolic element in taking her upstairs. In doing so, John repositions JonBenet from a scene of potential foul play to a place of family witness and emotional appeal. The act itself serves as both literal and symbolic removal of her body from the implications of the basement. In this way, his quick decision accomplishes what might otherwise have taken time to strategize. This adds a layer of intentionality masked by emotional urgency. Ultimately, the speed slowness contradiction reveals a pattern of behavioral inconsistency that is more aligned with impression management than authentic grief. The slowness in critical areas, like the neck, and the speed in superficial ones, like removing tape or lifting her body, speak to a deeper dissonance. What appears at first to be urgency becomes, under deductive reasoning, a tightly controlled series of moves, choreographed not by chaos but by calculation. Third, the selective rescue, abandonment of the neck ligature, and the illusion of aid. The most logically perplexing part of John's actions is his failure to address the ligature around JonBenet's neck, the very site that was most indicative of the cause of death. From a deductive standpoint, if one is truly encountering a child who appears unresponsive and whose lips are blue, attention should gravitate first to the face and neck, the primary indicators of respiratory failure. Removing tape from the mouth might be a natural reaction, but to skip past the neck ligature altogether while untying the less lethal wrist bindings reflects a cognitive dissonance between what is medically urgent and what is performatively convenient. The omission speaks louder than the action itself. Physiologically, the human response to blue lips is nearly universal, a signal of asphyxiation or severe hypoxia. The most immediate course of action is to check the airway, remove any obstruction, or at least alleviate anything constricting the throat. That John, even after seeing the tape and wrist ligature, did not reach for the neck tells us that his sense of urgency may have been staged. It is not just that he neglected the most pressing physical sign, it's that he diverted his effort to tasks that could symbolically demonstrate concern without producing further forensic complications. The neck ligature posed a risk, possibly of transferring fibers or disturbing evidence, so he left it untouched. This act of selective assistance hints at what criminologists refer to as token intervention, a behavior meant to fulfill the appearance of help rather than its substance. By removing the tape and loosening one wrist ligature, John could visually signal action to others in the room while avoiding the one site that would demand actual courage or provoke emotional unraveling. This tokenism in rescue behavior is not uncommon in staged crimes, where perpetrators craft scenes that mimic chaos or panic, but are quietly designed to preserve or shield certain truths from forensic scrutiny. Philosophically, this avoidance aligns with existential theories about guilt and concealment. When a person avoids the most morally and practically necessary task in a crisis, it often suggests internal conflict, not just over what occurred, but over what is being hidden. The choice to leave the neck untouched while interfering with peripheral restraints fits within this frame. It suggests a person simultaneously trying to do the right thing in the eyes of witnesses while psychologically avoiding the epicenter of horror, the very act or evidence that might implicate or shatter them. Another element that makes this behavior suspect is the complete absence of improvisational problem solving. Under real panic, we often witness frantic attempts to cut, untie, or even break objects to free a victim. Yet John made no such effort. He did not yell for scissors. He did not demand help. He did not use brute force. This absence of chaotic problem solving instinct is highly inconsistent with genuine crisis behavior. Instead, his efforts stopped at the point where they would have required true struggle or might have unveiled more damning evidence. Forensically, this is the equivalent of a soft touch. The decisions made here appear tailored to minimize contact with areas that could yield evidence, whether consciously or unconsciously. John's restraint in this context suggests an individual aware of contamination risk, transfer evidence, or the possibility that tampering might disrupt a broader narrative. His acts, therefore, do not read as grief-stricken fatherhood, but as a curated response within a larger effort to manage optics, both with those present in the house and those who would later investigate. This same contradiction, taking action and yet not taking the most necessary action, creates a shadow narrative, that of concealment cloaked as care. John knew enough to pretend to help. He did not dare go far enough to truly intervene, and therein lies the philosophical problem, the disjunction between motive and movement. His body moved, but not in the direction of truth. It moved in the direction of shielding, of selective removal, of symbolic empathy that avoided the fatal sight of violence. In conclusion, the refusal to engage with the neck ligature strips away any presumption of frantic rescue. It isolates a single truth. The rescuer avoided the point of pain. Whether from guilt, fear of implication, or the cold calculus of someone reconstructing a story, John Ramsey's selective help provides more insight than his visible actions. In the world of forensic reasoning, what someone chooses not to touch is often more telling than what they do. The OCR 1997 to 01-8 supplemental report Linda Arn JonBenet Ramsey .pdf further supports this, indicating that after JonBenet's body was brought upstairs, Linda Arndt explicitly told John Ramsey that he could say goodbye to his daughter, but he could not move her body, touch her hands, or lower the blanket. This instruction effectively halted any further attempts to untie or manipulate the ligatures by John Ramsey while he was in the presence of law enforcement upstairs. Therefore, Linda Arndt did not issue an instruction to John Ramsey about stopping his interaction with the knots while he was still downstairs in the basement. His initial attempts to untie the ligatures occurred immediately upon discovery in the privacy of the cellar. Linda Arndt's intervention and specific instructions regarding the handling of JonBenet's body and the ligatures took place only after John Ramsey had carried her upstairs to the living room. Psychological substitution and guilt management, the symbolism of presentation. John's act of bringing JonBenet's body upstairs mirrors a common psychological tactic used when time, guilt, or failure meets authority, symbolic compliance. The comparison to a student handing in an incomplete project is more than metaphor. It reflects the psychological framework of performative submission. By placing the body at Linda Arndt's feet, John appears to be presenting himself as cooperative, helpful, and transparent. However, what is symbolically offered is not closure but deflection. The implication is, I did what I could, I'm not hiding anything. This performance masks incompletion, both literal and investigative. The urgency in bringing her upstairs appears more psychological than practical. If the ligature on the wrist was too difficult to untie, the logical next step would have been to ask for help downstairs, where the forensic environment was intact. But the hurried move upstairs disrupts this flow of logic. Instead, the act becomes a performance of resolution, staged at the feet of authority to achieve the social effect of submission and finality. It closes the curtain on whatever was happening in the basement before anyone else could observe it. This shifts the inquiry away from what happened in the act of discovery toward what is now being displayed. Philosophically, criminologists speak of the difference between actus reus and mens rea. In this context, John's behavior complicates both. The act of moving the body is not in itself illegal, but it is epistemologically disruptive. It erases what could have been known. The mens rea, if any, hides beneath a veil of performative urgency and fatherly distress. This confounds the forensic process by introducing emotion as a shield against scrutiny. The display of the body thus becomes an emotional truth used to obscure forensic truth. From a physiological standpoint, human stress reactions, particularly under watchful eyes, manifest in actions that appear rushed but are calculated to reduce internal discomfort. This internal need for psychological relief, especially if one believes their innocence or moral righteousness is already presumed, leads to choices that prioritize emotional closure over procedural correctness. John's submission of the body can be seen as a way to alleviate his own tension, especially if he felt he had done enough to fix something that had gone terribly wrong. Psychologically, there's also a concept called response framing, where a person chooses actions that frame their role in a particular way. By delivering JonBenet to Linda rather than calling her down, John frames himself as an active agent rather than a passive witness. In doing so, he subtly controls the narrative of what has been found, how it was found, and who found it. This soft control of the timeline distorts our understanding of when specific decisions were made and why certain procedures weren't followed. Forensic framing, particularly in child death investigations, relies heavily on the first actions taken at discovery. The fact that John removed tape and began untying cords immediately, then carried the body upstairs, disturbs this frame irreparably. The presentation thus acts as a forensic breakage, a forced pivot away from the original scene. It's as if a rough draft of a crime scene has been scribbled over and replaced with a cleaner, curated copy. Even if that act was motivated by emotional distress, its effect on the investigation is one of deliberate interruption. Moreover, the guilt management dynamic can be seen as a strategy of preemptive justification. Just as a student says, I turned it in, it just isn't done, John seems to be saying, I found her and brought her to you, I just couldn't finish untying her. This introduces a kind of pre-failure excuse. a way to ensure that no matter what is found later, he can point back to this emotional submission and say he did his best. It buys goodwill in a moment that should have been reserved for strict evidence preservation. Ultimately, this entire act of presentation reflects a deep confusion between emotional truth and forensic truth. In a moment where precision and protocol were required, John offered vulnerability and performance. That may make him look human, but it also disrupts the core mechanisms by which justice seeks to separate narrative from fact. The body, once moved, once touched, once presented, loses its original context, and what is lost in that moment can never be regained. Avoidance, redirection, and forensic interference, the misuse of time and help. John Ramsey's decision not to remain in the basement and continue attempting to untie the ligature around JonBenét's wrist, especially once Linda Arndt was approaching, raises substantial questions about motivation, psychological state, and forensic awareness. If urgency and emotional overwhelm were the only factors, it would be expected that he might call for help while still attending to her at the scene of discovery. But he did not. Instead, he chose to interrupt the timeline of intervention by relocating the body. In terms of logic, this is a critical deviation. A man in distress might freeze, might scream, might call someone else to assist, but to relocate a body during the middle of attempted help and then continue the same help elsewhere in front of others is a behavior pattern more aligned with narrative redirection than with instinctual rescue. Psychologically, people under pressure often switch environments when their current one triggers feelings of helplessness, shame, or scrutiny. The basement, isolated and damning in its silence, may have felt like a trap, an unbearable space of implication. By moving upstairs, John entered a social arena where the presence of others could dilute his ownership of the scene. In this light, his decision to continue untying the ligature in front of others appears less as a genuine attempt to help and more as a calculated shift toward collective visibility, a movement from forensic intimacy to public absolution. Philosophically, criminology engages with the idea of forensic disruption as concealment by proximity, when someone tampers with a scene not to remove evidence, but to surround it with confusion and emotion. Here, John's continued tampering with the ligature upstairs, instead of allowing police intervention or preserving the scene, creates a new layer of ambiguity. It invites chaos into the investigation under the guise of care. He doesn't explicitly destroy evidence, but by operating in a zone he no longer had a right to touch, he casts doubt on everything that came before and after. Logically, it makes no sense to begin untying a wrist in private and then unmove the entire body to finish the job somewhere else. If anything, the move implies a break in the flow of problem solving, a moment when John made the choice to be seen and doing something rather than simply undoing it. And this becomes especially damning when paired with the psychological truth that people who know they are being watched often perform at the expense of authenticity. His actions now exist in a performative context where even helpful gestures are contaminated by timing and motive. The decision not to ask for scissors or a tool in the moment is also revealing. In normal emergency scenarios, when a problem cannot be solved manually, a tool becomes the logical next step. But instead of requesting help in that form, John opted to bring the problem to others, carrying the evidence, the body, and the context all in one bundle. In doing so, he introduced fresh contamination to the body, the clothing, and the scene, while bypassing the most rational solution available, delegated help that would preserve the scene and assist the victim. This shows either extreme short-sightedness or a conscious redirection away from the basement. From a forensic standpoint, the chain of custody, meaning the integrity of the crime scene from discovery to examination, was severed the moment JonBenét's body was relocated. The ligature itself, once handled in two separate locations under different lighting, pressure, and contact conditions, becomes compromised. What was once potential high-value evidence becomes ambiguous. Touch DNA, fiber transfers, cord tension, all these are altered when the scene of the crime is no longer the location of observation. The police, arriving at an already altered tableau, can no longer trust what they are seeing. There is also the issue of timing and psychological projection. John's claim that he tried to help but gave up because the ligature was too difficult mirrors a narrative often used by individuals seeking to avoid judgment, and I did what I could, but it was too much for me. This is less about the victim's needs and more about the actor's capacity and the desire to retain innocence. In this framework, the presentation upstairs and the renewed attempt at untying the knot become tools for guilt management rather than effective emergency response. Finally, we must return to the philosophical core of criminology, the question of intention masked by plausible behavior. Was John acting to save his daughter, to gain sympathy, to obscure an earlier timeline? These are not accusations, but necessary frameworks for understanding behavior that undermines standard investigative logic. When someone chooses to interrupt a secure scene and continue an already compromised act of assistance in front of others, It suggests not a man panicking, but a man hoping his panic would suffice as explanation. The blame, transfer, and psychological projection in crisis response. The moment John Ramsey redirected responsibility toward Linda Arndt for telling him to stop tampering with JonBenét's body, we see a key psychological maneuver that signals projection, displacement, and evasion. Instead of acknowledging that he had overstepped forensic boundaries, violating both the crime scene and the chain of custody, he reassigns the blame to the authority figure who told him to cease. This is not just an emotional response under pressure. It reveals a deeper, more troubling cognitive dissonance, an inability or unwillingness to see himself as interfering. It reflects a common defensive behavior seen in criminal psychology, where the actor seeks to exonerate himself by indicting the process or the authority attempting to restore order. From a deductive reasoning standpoint, if John had been truly focused on preserving the dignity of his daughter or aiding her in any meaningful way, the moment Linda Arndt intervened should have provided him both relief and validation. Relief that professionals were now in control, validation that his limited efforts were being superseded by trained hands. But that is not what happened. Instead, we see indignation. That reaction suggests he did not welcome authority intervention, which invites the question, what was he trying to do that could not tolerate scrutiny? This emotional pushback implies that the tampering served more than a grieving father's impulse. It had the features of narrative shaping. Bringing the body upstairs gave him audience. Continuing to fumble with the ligature offered him perceived credibility. Being told to stop shattered that performance and threatened to cast his actions not as care, but as interference. When Linda stepped in, it wasn't just a command, it was a forensic correction. And John, instead of stepping back, responded with the indignation of someone who had lost control of a narrative they were trying to manage. Psychologically, this is a classic moment of authoritarian deflection, where an individual under stress attempts to reclaim dominance by blaming those who enforce boundaries. In law enforcement, this pattern is often observed in suspects who shift the lens of scrutiny toward the officers themselves, questioning their tone, their timing, or their methods. What matters is not the content of the correction, but the ego injury caused by being stopped. John's emotional response fits this profile, placing him not in the role of a cooperative father, but a defensive actor under pressure. Philosophically, this invites reflection on what it means to tamper in the presence of law. Is it an act of desperation or a final claim of ownership? In forensic criminology, post-crime behavior is more revealing than the crime itself. What a person chooses to do when they know they're being watched, when they know help is present, often uncovers the motivations that were hidden in the act. John's refusal to yield to the protocol and then blaming Linda for doing what any officer would have done transforms this moment into an ethical failure, one rooted in power, not panic. There's also the symbolic dimension. Linda's command severed John's final physical connection to the body. Until then, he was doing something. His hands were involved. His performance was ongoing. When that link was cut, the narrative of control collapsed. His response to that collapse was not grief, but blame, projecting fault onto Linda for stripping him of the only tool left to shield himself, action. In that moment, stopping meant exposure, and exposure meant implication. In forensic terms, John's continued interference also risked erasing or contaminating potential clues that could have identified a third party, or conversely, implicated himself. Yet instead of honoring the investigative process, he persisted, and when corrected, he did not express concern about preservation of evidence, but personal offense. That shows us he was not operating with investigative clarity. He was engaged in something more psychologically charged. The desperate attempt to anchor his role in the narrative by being the doer, the fixer, the father in control. Ultimately, the philosophical heart of this moment is this: real innocence does not fear forensic oversight. A grieving father wants help, wants guidance, wants answers. He doesn't resist boundaries or bristle at commands. He doesn't shift blame to the only people trying to preserve truth. John's reaction, therefore, cannot be read merely as grief or shock. It has to be interpreted within the criminological framework of projection, scene manipulation, and the unraveling of control when faced with an authority that interrupts the performance. I want to take a step back and discuss a few things in relation to this. Let's start with Patsy's fibers and the performance of absence. When we look at the scene through the lens of John Ramsey's movements, his removal of duct tape, his failure to focus on the ligature, his decision to bring the body upstairs, we begin to see a kind of behavioral architecture take form. But that structure isn't built by John alone. Patsy Ramsey's statements, her recollections, and her positioning in the narrative all operate from a central premise that she was never near the materials directly involved in JonBenét's death. And yet, fibers consistent with a red, gray, and black acrylic garment believed to be hers are reportedly found in some of the most critical locations: the ligature, the blanket, the duct tape, even the paint tray. That doesn't establish blame, but it does demand inquiry. Because when absence is the claim, physical presence becomes a question. This pattern of fiber discovery is not incidental. These aren't broad textile matches like cotton or denim. These are color and composition specific acrylic fibers that forensic experts said showed no indication of originating from any other known source in the house. That doesn't mean there's certainty, but it does mean there's weight. The fact that these fibers show up across multiple objects that Patsy denied interacting with is what makes them noteworthy, especially when those objects, tape, cord, blanket, aren't just random house items. They are central to the timeline of JonBenét's last moments. That's not an accusation, that's a data point. And this brings us back to the theme we've been exploring in this episode: performance under pressure. While John's actions may reflect an emotional choreography of urgency and control, Patsy's statements perform something different: distance. Her narrative consistently pulls her away from the materials, the spaces, and the tools that forensic science keeps pulling her back toward. It's not proof of anything malicious, but it is peculiar, especially given how closely knit those particular fibers are to a garment she either wore or wore something strikingly similar to on the night of the Christmas party. Much of this comes down to the nature of acrylic fibers themselves. They're known to shed easily, especially in dry climates like Colorado's in December. All it takes is brushing up against a surface, touching tape, wrapping a blanket, or leaning near a textured object to transfer those fibers, which makes their appearance at the crime scene explainable if, and only if, there had been some form of contact. But here's where it gets curious. Patsy didn't claim accidental contact. She denied proximity altogether. She said she didn't use the paint tray, she didn't apply the tape, she didn't handle the cord. And that's where the contradiction, not conclusion, but contradiction arises. We also can't ignore the context of that sweater or jacket. This wasn't casual loungewear. Patsy herself said she wouldn't use it for anything messy, like painting. It was described as a good garment, the kind of thing one might wear to a formal dinner with close friends on Christmas night. That detail matters, because when fibers from that very garment show up on items that imply physical engagement, tape, cord, blanket, it challenges the casual assumption that these could have just floated through the air. It suggests a moment of friction, a moment that may have happened earlier than expected, or in a way no one has explained. None of this is conclusive, but it fits into a broader pattern, one we've explored across episodes. The repeated presence of both Patsy's and John's fibers on items they claim little or no contact with, the presence of familiar fingerprints on the pineapple bowl and tea glass, the repeated suggestion that they were not near the areas or items where their biological or fiber evidence shows up. It's not the presence of these items that's strange, it's their consistency. It keeps reappearing, not randomly, but almost rhythmically, across the timeline and the physical space. And that rhythm, like any rhythm, becomes hard to ignore. When Lynn Wood, Patsy's attorney, argued that there were an extraordinary number of other fibers present on these same objects, he never clarified what those fibers were. That's not necessarily suspicious. It could be strategic. But it leaves the rest of us with an incomplete picture. And when the only detailed fiber trail we do have happens to match a garment associated with the mother of the victim, and there's no competing fiber trail to offset it, it's understandable that some observers might raise questions. Not accusations, not certainties, just questions. And that's what this entire segment is about. Not certainty, but the gravity of coincidence. If the fibers were found in one location, maybe they drifted there. Two locations, perhaps static transfer, but across the duct tape, the blanket, the neck cord, and the paint tray, that's more than floating debris. That's a sequence. And the further you follow that sequence, the more it starts to mirror movement, intentional or not, conscious or not. That doesn't mean we know what happened, but it does mean we need to look at it as a pattern worth revisiting. So, in the context of this current episode, where we're analyzing how John moved the body, what he touched, and what he may have been trying to shape visually, the fiber record brings a silent but pointed counterbalance. While John performed control, Patsy performed detachment. But the fibers may have been performing their own story all along, not because they tell us everything, but because they tell us something that hasn't been fully reconciled. And when absence is the stated truth, but presence keeps quietly showing up under the microscope, that's not a conclusion. That's a contradiction we're sitting with. Furthermore, we look back at the duct tape contradiction, where casual observations that start to stack up, because the more you think about it, the more things just don't quite add up. We've got this piece of black duct tape, right? It's on JonBenét's mouth, and that alone is enough to stop you in your tracks. But what's strange is how easily it was removed. No resistance, no sticking, just lifted right off, almost like it was placed there more for show than for silence. And when you think about it like that, it doesn't really scream panic or urgency or even function. It almost feels like an afterthought, or worse, a finishing touch. And when you put that next to what John Ramsey said, it gets even weirder. because John didn't just say he found it and pulled it off. He immediately started giving theories about what kind of tape it might be. He calls it not regular duct tape, maybe something like what Fleet White uses on his boat. And that's oddly specific. It's not, I don't know what it was. It's maybe it's marine tape. Who thinks like that in that moment? That's what gets my attention. Because when you're in shock, your brain doesn't go looking for brand categories, it reacts. So why is John already explaining it away before anyone's even asked? Then you match that up with what Patsy said, that she didn't own any tape like that she wouldn't even have duct tape around. And now you've got two different stories running at the same time. One says maybe it's from a boat, the other says we've never had anything like that. So now we've got the same piece of tape doing double duty. It's foreign, but also familiar. It's from somewhere, but also from nowhere. That's where the contradiction really lives. It's in the vagueness. It's the kind of narrative fog that's hard to walk through without tripping on something. And then fibers show up. That's where things get a little funny, but not in a haha kind of way. Funny as in curious, because the tape, the same piece that nobody recognizes, somehow has fibers on it that match the jacket Patsy was likely wearing that night. That jacket, not some random laundry room throw blanket, a specific red, black, and gray acrylic garment that was visually identified and forensically matched. So now you've got this tape that no one claims, but it's wearing her fibers like an accessory. That's a little too coincidental to not at least raise an eyebrow. So now you've got to ask, how do those fibers get there? Maybe it's transfer. Someone brushes past her, then uses the tape. Maybe it's household contamination. Sure, maybe. But now we're saying this rare, unusual, not in our house kind of tape happens to touch just the right surface or person or item to collect the very fibers from the one person who says she never went near it. That's a pretty specific chain of events. Not impossible, but kind of intricate. Like if you had to map it out, it wouldn't be a straight line. It would be a loop with three detours and a backflip. And then, just for fun, let's drop this into the larger conversation we're having in this episode. John Ramsey carries JonBenét's body up from the basement, bypassing evidence, skipping police instructions, and doing things in a very precise, controlled way. He's not sloppy. He's not wild. He's deliberate. So now imagine this tape, placed neatly, cut clean, removed without a fight, and it fits that same style. Not chaos, not haste, but something that feels dressed up, almost like a visual choice, something that says a lot more than it does, which loops us right back to the paint tray, the cord, the blanket, all the other items that Patsy says she never touched, but that somehow collected traces of her clothing. It's not about guilt, it's about presence. It's about this repeated pattern of, I wasn't there, followed by physical evidence that says, well, someone who looked a lot like you might have been. That's the tension. It's not in the conclusion, it's in the accumulation. Each thing on its own might be nothing. But when you start lining them up, it starts to feel like someone kept walking through a scene they later claimed to have avoided entirely. And that's what makes this whole tape thing so layered. It's not just tape, it's a thread that connects to the way this entire story is told. I didn't touch that. That wasn't ours. I didn't go down there. But the objects themselves seem to tell a slightly different story. And look, stories can overlap, memories can fail, but fibers and tape, they don't forget, they don't improvise, they just are. And that stillness next to all the movement of the narrative is where the mystery breathes. So when we step back and ask ourselves what the duct tape actually means in the grand scheme of this case, maybe it's not just about silence, maybe it's about presentation, a statement, a visual cue that was supposed to speak louder than the truth ever could. And when you think about it like that, and then bring in the matching fibers, the coordinated garments, and the contradictions that keep multiplying, what you're left with isn't an answer. It's a whole new set of questions. We then think about the black fibers consistent with John's shirt. We know from the investigative records that black fibers were discovered on JonBenét's underwear, and that those fibers were found to be consistent with a black wool shirt John Ramsey turned over nearly 2 years later. Not a shirt he was confirmed to be wearing the day after her death, but one requested because of those very fibers. That's not speculation, that's sequencing. And when sequencing happens in reverse like that, when the evidence finds the clothing, not the other way around, it creates a quiet problem that doesn't go away. Because the shirt wasn't part of the known outfit John wore the morning of December 26th. That was described as blue and white with khakis, according to Detective Linda Arndt. So why did fibers from a black Israeli wool shirt turned in nearly 2 years later show up on JonBenet in such a private and sensitive location? We're not assigning guilt here, but it's the specificity and direction of that trail that makes it more than just household contamination. This wasn't a common use item. This was high-end wool, and it raised enough questions that investigators circled back to it long after the fact. And what makes this even more intriguing is how it mirrors a pattern we keep seeing: personal fibers showing up where personal contact was denied. We saw it with Patsy's fibers on the tape, the cord, the blanket, objects that were supposedly foreign to her. We saw it in the basement, where she claimed she never really went, and yet her fibers were embedded in the staging elements. And now we're seeing the same thing with John, a piece of clothing that shouldn't have been involved, showing up in exactly the place it shouldn't be. So when you step back, it's not about accusing anyone. It's about seeing how these traces betray a kind of presence. Because we've been talking this whole episode about performance, about how panic can be rehearsed, how grief can be staged, and how narratives can be built after the fact. But these fibers don't know how to perform. They don't know how to lie. They just are. And in that honesty, they disrupt the illusion of distance. Because if a person's words say, I wasn't involved in that part, but their shirt shows up on the body, then we have to ask what parts of this story are being overdirected. And remember, it wasn't John who offered the shirt. It was law enforcement who came to him specifically asking for it after identifying the fiber type. That's a reversal of innocence, not in a moral or legal sense, but in the chain of narrative. When your evidence makes the first move, it suggests the truth has a current of its own. And that's what's happening here. A black wool shirt that hadn't been discussed publicly gets pulled into the frame because the scene itself whispered its presence. Now fold that into everything else we've discussed. The contradictions in duct tape handling, the presence of Patsy's fibers on objects she denied touching, the suggestion that both parents were unfamiliar with key objects later shown to contain their trace evidence. All of these things on their own might be brushed off. But together, they start to play a kind of background music, quiet, persistent, and hard to turn off. A low hum of things not quite adding up, of distance claimed, but presence proven. And we have to revisit the idea of control, because if everything about the Ramsey statements was reactive, you'd expect more chaos. You'd expect stains, noise, mess. But what you get instead is a curated stillness, almost like someone tried to erase just enough without wiping too much. And it's in that space between what's admitted and what's evident that these fibers start to speak, not with volume, but with timing, with placement, with specificity. And again, this isn't about jumping to conclusions. It's about acknowledging the growing geometry of contradiction. A shirt from 2 years ago showing up on a little girl's underwear, a roll of duct tape no one admits owning, a paint tray someone cleaned just enough. These aren't gotchas. They're echoes. And when all those echoes lead back to the people who said, I didn't touch that, you start to wonder what else was touched quietly, what else was moved, arranged, and then forgotten. Which brings us full circle to the episode's theme, because if staging grief is about projecting a clean narrative in a messy moment, then these fibers, Patsy's, John's, red, black, wool, acrylic, are what remain when the script wears thin. They're the creases in the performance. And in those creases, a new story tries to emerge, one that doesn't have answers but refuses to disappear. The last point I want to make about this is about the basement. There's something quietly intriguing about how the Ramseys talked about their basement. In certain moments, they described it like it was barely a part of their lives. John, for instance, once said he wasn't too familiar with the layout. But in other instances, both John and Patsy recalled very specific reasons for going down there. And that contrast, it doesn't accuse anyone of anything, but it does make you pause. Because if someone claims they're unfamiliar with a space, you expect them to be a little vague or maybe dismissive about it. But when you then hear that John used the basement for cigar breaks, and that Patsy retrieved wrapping paper or other supplies from storage down there, the picture starts to look a little different. It goes from being an unused corner of the house to a somewhat active space, one they visited for practical reasons. And maybe that's all it was, just a gap in memory, maybe a slip under pressure. But the contradiction stands out because it's repeated. On the one hand, there's the version of the basement as dark, cluttered, and basically avoided. On the other hand, there are clear mentions of using it for storage, for holiday prep, and for private moments like cigar smoking. That doesn't feel like a room that was off limits or barely used. It sounds like a room that had a role in the rhythm of the household. Now tie that into what we've been exploring in this episode, the question of how certain narratives about that morning were framed, timed, and presented. When someone claims to be unfamiliar with the space but seems to know exactly where to go and what door to open, it stands out. John didn't appear lost or hesitant when he went down there that morning. His movements were direct. That could be instinct. It could also be routine. And then there's the fiber discussion, which adds another layer. Fibers similar to Patsy's jacket were found on items located in the basement, including the blanket and the ligature. John's black wool shirt, later turned over to investigators, was tied to fibers that showed up on JonBenet's clothing. None of this proves anything definitive, but in the context of a space they both reportedly didn't frequent, it makes you think. It's not that any one piece is explosive, but taken together, the small details, who went where, when, and how often, begin to feel more important. If someone says they rarely go into a space, and yet fibers associated with them appear in that very room, It opens up bare questions, not necessarily criminal ones, but logical ones. It raises the possibility that familiarity with the basement may have been downplayed after the fact. And that same pattern shows up in the duct tape conversation we've had before. The Ramseys didn't identify the tape as something they owned. John once floated a theory that it might have come from boating gear. Patsy didn't know where it came from at all. But then fibers like hers end up on that tape. Again, no smoking gun, but the same tension, an object reportedly unfamiliar, yet somehow connected. So what are we left with? A lot of maybes, a lot of what ifs, but also a thread, a quiet consistency where things that are described as distant or unfamiliar wind up appearing closer than expected. That doesn't mean there's something sinister behind it, but it does mean the initial story might have been simplified, maybe even softened, in the aftermath of an unthinkable tragedy. And the basement in all of this becomes more than just a physical location. It becomes a stand-in for everything that wasn't meant to be looked at too closely. A room said to be unimportant, that ends up holding some of the most curious elements in the case. And when we notice those moments where language distances but evidence leans in, we're not making accusations. We're just recognizing that memory and meaning don't always agree. And that's what keeps us looking closer. So when we take a step back and sit with all of this, what we're really looking at is a gap, not necessarily in truth, but in presentation, a space between what's been said and what continues to surface in the background. And sometimes those gaps don't scream, they whisper, but they whisper loud enough to leave an imprint. You start to notice not just what's missing, but what keeps quietly returning. There's been a consistent theme across this case, especially in the things we've been exploring lately. A narrative that centers on shock and chaos, but still manages to avoid certain places and objects. The basement, the duct tape, the blanket, the cords, all of them become these quiet containers of contradiction. They're not always mentioned, but they're always present. And that's what makes this whole thing so hard to sit with, not because it hands us answers, but because it doesn't. The fibers tell a story, not a conclusive one, but a suggestive one. Fibers similar to Patsy's jacket show up in multiple places that weren't supposed to be touched. Fibers from a black wool shirt later turned over by John show up in places that no one can cleanly explain. These aren't single data points, they're patterns. And whether those patterns are accidental, explainable, or something more, they challenge the simplicity of the official narrative. And maybe that's what makes the basement such a focal point, not because of what happened there, but because of how it's been spoken about. A room once described as unfamiliar somehow becomes the scene of familiarity. A space once minimized turns out to have been accessed, used, and remembered in ways that weren't always clear in the original interviews. That doesn't mean anyone lied, but it does mean that memory, when filtered through grief and panic, might simplify things that were more complex. Which brings us right back to performance. The idea that not all behavior in a crisis is raw or chaotic. Sometimes it's managed. Sometimes it's calculated not out of guilt, but out of survival. People perform for many reasons: to protect themselves, to stay composed, to maintain a version of events that feels safer than the one unfolding. And in that light, some of these inconsistencies start to feel less like mistakes and more like rehearsals. The duct tape, for example, is one of the clearest symbols of this disconnect. It was there, but no one knew where it came from. It didn't contain saliva. It didn't function as a restraint, yet it was placed and it stayed there, even as the body was moved. Why? We don't know. But it fits the theme we keep coming back to: details that appear placed more for the benefit of the story than for utility. That doesn't mean the Ramseys orchestrated a false narrative, but it does suggest that the narrative might have shifted over time, whether to cope, to protect, or to avoid. And when that shift happens, it leaves small artifacts behind: fibers in strange places, contradictions about access, objects no one remembers buying. And those things, while small on their own, add up to a kind of dissonance, a feeling that something about this whole picture was a little too neat, a little too managed. And when we consider these elements together, not in isolation, but in relation to one another, we start to see a pattern, a structure, a rhythm that doesn't quite match the chaos it was meant to explain. Maybe that's human, maybe that's protective instinct, but maybe it's also an invitation to keep asking questions, to hold space for the pieces that don't fit yet, to stay with the tension. Because at the end of the day, we're not looking to accuse, we're just looking to understand. And sometimes understanding means sitting with the discomfort of contradiction. Sometimes it means acknowledging that grief can stage itself, that memory can edit, that presence can be denied even as it leaves traces. And in a case like this, those traces might just be the closest thing we have to the parts of the story that were never meant to be told. So, to close this out, John's choice to handle the situation personally rather than alerting law enforcement immediately is more than just a misstep. It's a psychological signature. The act of transporting JonBenet upstairs, touching the tape, the ligatures, and placing her body down before officers is not neutral. It's an act loaded with implication. a man trying to appear composed, decisive, and paternal under pressure. But in that performance, he also oversteps. He crosses into tampering, into action that obstructs rather than aids. And when the motive for this urgency is unclear, it forces investigators and observers to ask, what was he really trying to do? From a criminological standpoint, the principle of guilty demeanor becomes relevant. It doesn't mean someone is guilty of the crime, but rather that their behavior is inconsistent with innocence. The urgency mixed with delay, the speed of the actions combined with the failure to call for help, and the continuation of tampering even under police supervision all represent indicators that something deeper was at play. John may not have been thinking with criminal precision, but he was certainly thinking with personal consequence in mind, and that alone reshapes how we interpret his role in those critical minutes. Ultimately, the image of John standing before Linda Arndt with his daughter's lifeless body is both poignant and suspicious. It asks us to consider whether this was the final act of a desperate father or the first act of damage control. What appears on the surface to be grief may also be a calculated pivot, one designed to limit exposure, mitigate suspicion, and shift perception. And when someone's first instinct under pressure is to manage the scene rather than to preserve it, the line between reaction and strategy becomes hard to ignore. I'll leave it right there for now, but hope you're doing well. Hope you're taking care of yourself. And like, share, subscribe. Thank you for all your support and everything that you do for this channel. And until next time, take it easy.